when you are, say, policing language, what I like with Rancière is you can say, you're not doing politics. And like, you'll like it or not.
You are literally
take it or
just
leave
the
it.
police.
You're the fucking cops.
What a diss.
You're the cops.
I thought you were all ACAB.
Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Owen, and here with me today is Gil.
Hello.
Will.
What's up?
And Lillian.
Hi.
So for today's episode, we're going to be discussing French philosopher Jacques Rancière's 1995 book, Disagreement. Rancière's vast corpus ranges from his early work alongside and later against Louis Althusser to the development of egalitarian pedagogical theory in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, to historical and archival work on revolutionary workers' movements in the 19th century, to his interventions in political theory in the 90s, and finally to a comprehensive rethinking of aesthetics and its relation to politics. The reason I proposed addressing Disagreement, his core treatise in political theory, is that I thought it might provide, among other things, a helpful framework for a general reflection on equality and the meaning of egalitarian politics. At the heart of Rancière's political thought is this principle of equality, or sometimes he calls it an axiom of equality. He contends that equality ought not to be conceived as a desired state of affairs or end goal of emancipatory politics, but should instead be understood as its initial assumption, its condition of possibility. Virtually every social order is predicated on a hierarchical distribution of assigned functions based on the apparently natural suitability of certain classes of people for certain social roles and places. Plato's myth of the metallic souls that assign everyone to their social position is but the most exemplary and flagrant necessitation of hierarchical social configurations. For Rancière, all social orders congeal into naturalized distributions of social lots, and for this reason, they are all iterations of what he calls a police order, which clearly extends beyond the order forcefully imposed by the cops. Opposed to the order of the police is politics, which he defines quite restrictively as the egalitarian confrontation with the police order by those whom it relegates to narrow and subjugated functions. So for this reason, and one of the controversial parts of Rancière's work is that he claims that politics is actually something that is intermittent. It's quite rare. It has nothing to do with government it's not inherently tied to the institutions that we live under. It is a rare, intermittent, egalitarian process of emancipation. So I definitely want to talk about the politics-police distinction quite a bit, but why don't we start with his way of parsing equality? What do you make of equality as a practical axiom? Not as a kind of desired state of affairs. Does it spark concern? Does it seem too formalistic? Is it right? I think that might be a good place to start before we jump into the details of the police and politics and all that.
So how does he think about equality? Sorry if that, what do you say it's too formalistic? What do you mean?
Well, he says that he means it in a formal sense, right? And so in order to understand equality, it kind of starts from a negative deduction, right? He says, every claim to justify inequality is inherently bogus, right? And why is it bogus? Because there is no arche, no founding principle of distinction and hierarchy in any society, right? Every society for Rancière is literally anarchic. It lacks a principle that would actually explain a natural order or distribution of functions, social positions, etc. Right? And so when he says that the principle of equality is formal, it's the pointing up. The demonstration is a term he uses a lot. It's the demonstration of basically how bunk these legitimizations and these justifications of inequality are, right? It's not material equality is another way of putting it. He's not speaking about like, he doesn't get into, although he is a Marxist of sorts, right? But he doesn't actually, when he talks about equality, invoke questions of like material possession or distribution, right? It's,
Well, he often explicitly says that he's talking and thinking about like inequality of intelligences. Like that's one of his like preferred formulations.
or
right?
capacities, right?
Or of capacities, of cognitive ability in some way. And so like one of the things that he's like, I think you're right that it's like a negative deduction. I think when you talk about equality in this sense as being a condition for the possibility of politics or any order at all, he means something like when someone in a supposedly dominant position within a hierarchy speaks down to those who are supposed to be lower than them, that speech act of being like, you're below me, you belong down there, actually presupposes this prior equality so that it could be understood in the first place.
It presupposes that its intelligibility presupposes equality of intelligence.
Yeah, the way that I thought about it, and I actually found myself, kind of getting into this text because so some things actually made a lot of sense to me. So in other words, the very act of having to discursively justify or even claim, inequality as natural, especially trying to discursively justify to those who are one's presumed inferiors, you could only presume they could understand that if you think that they are equal to you in some way. And so, I think the classic example of this is Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," where he's saying, why would you pass all of these laws against slaves reading or doing things unless you presume that they are the types of creatures who can understand these laws and thus be held responsible for their actions? And so, the practical axiom of equality seems to me, Rancière is saying that, every social order can find itself vulnerable to the fact that it must assume this shared space of receptivity and understanding, even when trying to assume that this is a space of hierarchy and social differentiation, and that this anarchic reality of politics can always reemerge and challenge our distribution of trying to stabilize a social order through these roles and these places.
Yeah, that's why I think like his work on the history of worker struggles is really important for understanding how this principle of equality functions. Because when he goes into the archives and he looks at the 1848 or 1830 in France, like these revolutionary moments, and he examines what like workers in those movements were doing and saying, what you don't find is like people wailing and making noise and saying, "I'm starving," right? What you find is actually like well-organized like stagings of capacities for political organization, capacities for speech. As he uses the term like the proofs of the possession of logos, and not just phone or voice, right? Not just screaming out in pain and saying, "I'm hungry, I want more," and resisting this representation of revolutionary struggles by the poor as somehow being like just irrational mobs like screaming for a bigger piece of the pie. And so it's not it's not only that those that are in positions of domination tend to tell on themselves, like it was what you were pointing out in the example of Frederick Douglass. They tell on themselves, they admit in a roundabout way that the thing that they're claiming isn't real actually is, right? The possession of equality of intelligence. But there's also the proof that goes on in movements and in struggles in which they always have creative ways of staging a set of capacities, of forming citizens' assemblies, Rancière was so interested in the fact that like workers in 19th century struggles would like put on plays, and they would actually organize like theatrical spectacles, and so it's that side of it too.
I love that French philosophers need to use ancient Greek and to translate these ideas back into English for us. I find that very helpful.
Yeah, it's fun.
Really helps the argument get through.
Honestly. So I actually thought also, along with the Frederick Douglass point, I also thought about some of the feminist arguments against humanism. Like most recently, probably Kate Mann was writing about the idea that people are oppressed because they're not seen as human by their oppressors. like seems to miss that like the reason they're subordinated is because they're human and they're like they threaten some kind of like interruption, or maybe they threaten the possibility of politics, and like that makes the idea that the logic of the subjugation is that they are not seen as moral equals. I suppose that's the point humanism is trying to make unlikely, particularly in a world where like we actually do expressly say that we think other people are human and moral equals. Like you have to kind of like do a lot of somersaulting to say that we just don't see each other as human anymore. I mean, I know like people make this point all the time, but I just like think this is less and less true as time goes on.
Yeah, this is interesting. And maybe like one of the questions that I always have about Rancière is like, we started out with this concept of equality, and another way I think of getting at this same sort of idea is thinking about its relationship to universality, because the claim is right that there is equality of all of intelligences, full stop, like across the board, right? This is in fact a universal sort of claim. And at some point he's describing, who is it, Jeanne d'Arc, this woman who runs for office in Paris or in France in like the 1840s, when that's not technically legally possible for like a woman to seek to hold office. And so like this exposes or demonstrates a wrong, and demonstrates that the supposed universality of the self-conception of this bourgeois order of liberté, égalité, is in fact a bloated particular, right? A bloated particularity masking itself as a universality. And this for him is like politics par excellence, like, right? Like showing that this supposed universality is not one by means of invoking this more fundamental presupposition of a universal equality or egalitarianism, right? And this is what he calls like wrong. This is like showing a wrong or a miscount. I don't know, like the thing that always bugged me about Rancière, as long as I've read and thought about him, is like this feels right. It all feels correct. But also, like, there's something that, I don't know, there's something that rubs me the wrong way about the kind of endlessness of it. That, like, every society presumably would do what he calls a miscount, right? That this is an unavoidable state of affairs. And then, like, politics is just whatever casts light on that. And I guess... Yeah.
Or when the miscount is redressed by what he calls like the part of those without a part in the social order. I mean, yeah, I have this issue too. I mean, I think the place I think people tend to point to is because when the issue of this eternal back and forth between politics and the police comes up, is that he says, well, you know, look, it's not like there aren't infinitely preferable police orders, right? He says like a police order in which like you get your eyes gouged out in order to ensure your subjugation is infinitely less preferable to like the police order
down.
Yeah, exactly. Thumbs down. It's infinitely less preferable to like the police order we live in, or he says he lives in 1990s France, right, in which the forms of subjugation are more subtle, you know, perhaps less extreme. And
so I think I have two thoughts, and I'll go with them in order, because I also wanted to pick up the thread of something I heard Lillian bringing up Kate Mann. But first, you know, so it seems to me that, you know, when Rancière talks about politics, and, you know, just to like, you know, remind yourself, so politics for him is intermittent. He even says, you know, it's probably rare. You know, it is it's a demonstration. It seems that, you know, there's one part where it's a negative demonstration of what calls itself universal is in fact not. But, you know, it doesn't do this insofar as the positive element isn't, and so here is the new abstract universal. In fact, it is insofar as I am particular, insofar as I am woman, proletariat, black, slave, we actually represent the universal. And it seems to me that even in that moment of, you know, the part, you know, that has no part, I believe is his like kind of famous phrase of it, it's not bringing in a settled and now this is what universality is and we live in the time of peace. This just, you know, inaugurates the contestation again, a new contestation, raises the contestation. Because, what I hear is, maybe we want to talk a bit about the police yet, but maybe we could just talk a bit more about politics, is there's no overcoming the police. I don't think Rancière thinks that. But what I was hearing, and you all pick what you want to respond to, so these are just my two thoughts, but with the Kate Mann point, I was also hearing, there's some work on dehumanization, that, thinks like, well, actually, if you really want to understand what's going on with dehumanization, it only works as dehumanization if you presume that the other person is, a receptive human creature who could bear, witness to that this is dehumanizing. If they were truly insensate, if they were truly irrational, then they wouldn't even receive this demonstration you're doing of trying to either create misogyny or racism, insert your value there. And so to kind of link these together, it seems like Rancière thinks that this is like a constant struggle of trying to disavow the very practical axiom that makes possible things like hierarchy or misogyny or racism, and politics is what reveals that disavowal. And and demonstrates it. You said you use demonstrates, but I can see how the aesthetics is here, stages a scene of it, and doesn't let us get away from that disavowal.
I think that's right, and I have the same question that Gil has, though, even in response to that. Like, I can see the point here, and it does sound right to me at some level, especially the sort of pulling out equality as like the moral and epistemological assumption of inequality and subjection. I like that. I also do think, like, when you say, Will, that like you can't overcome the police because the police is just this like generic name for whatever is not politics. Like,
social order.
I guess, like, I just have my usual question, which is about like conflating problems. Like, there are some like are you saying, so if there's no overcoming the police, are you saying that there's no such thing as political legitimacy? Okay, so that's like something philosophers would like to know, I'm sure. Are you saying that there's no such thing as justice? And maybe there is. Like, I don't know. I don't know his work well enough. And it could be that you're giving like just distinctly non-normative descriptions of the police and politics, and therefore the struggle can be interminable, but it can be better or worse, and maybe we just need other criteria. But I don't know. The police seems like a kind of a laden term to me. Yeah. And like, I just think that there's a difference between anticipating conflict in politics and like calling the opposite of that a police, and like not being able to have criteria for either of the things I mentioned. Because you can have a society that is basically legitimate to, like, I imagine, I don't work on legitimacy, but if you did, you could like imagine having a society that is basically legitimate by normative standards and to the people who live in it. Okay, and then there's still conflict. Like, you can imagine conflict, social movements, and so on. That doesn't mean that like one part of the population is unaccounted for or oppressed. And like, ideally, you would want to have a society in which people could be in conflict. This is like the idea of democracy, no? So if the point, like, so there's just like a kind of a paradox here that like I don't like love, even though I kind of buy the initial point. But it's also possible that he like solves this problem.
Like, I'm basically in agreement with that sentiment, especially the point about restricting. I used to like this whole calling every social order a police order. I think it's kind of sexy. Like, it's a good way to like delegitimize social orders in advance. But yeah, I generally am for a more restricted use of it. But I guess one kind of Rancière inspired response to your issue would be to say, has there ever been a regime of political legitimacy that didn't render certain classes or modes of participation illegitimate as one of their, maybe even as one of its conditions of possibility? And Rancière's question is what do you do, given that I think in his view, there's never been a social political order or an order of legitimate authority that hasn't delegitimized and not just excluded, but kind of like has incapacitated a certain segment or a class of people within, in its population. And so maybe it would be more useful to understand politics not at the level of that legitimacy building, but as what the people that are excluded from conditions of legitimate behavior and political expression, like what they do. I don't know if that's a response.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, like, again, I'm also not a Rancière scholar, but it seems to me that if he is right about, every order being fundamentally anarchic, it seems to me that Rancière would say that, there never is political legitimacy. There's never political legitimacy for Rancière, especially because politics, or politics, not the political politics, emerges sparsely, emerges as a challenge to legitimacy. And so if Rancière is right that if you by legitimacy you understand something along the lines of some distribution of a social order is as such uncontestable. I'm not saying like most philosophers understand legitimacy in this way, but he seems to be trying to say something like every instance of legitimacy is as such contingent. And so if you're looking for solid foundations of legitimacy that will carry on for long periods of time, perhaps you can have that, but that doesn't speak to whether they are legitimate as such. And so there's an anarchism in Rancière, if I'm understanding, that every moment of legitimacy, even if it extends for hundreds of years, is just awaiting its eruption of equality to challenge that distribution of order. But and maybe it's not helpful that he uses the term police, but he does say he wants to try to use this in a neutral, non-pejorative sense. And so maybe what he means is something like
by the way, that feels like a dance move to me. Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah,
come
you think
on,
so?
you don't really not want me to hear the negative connotation to the word police. Get out of here. Come on.
He's trying to be a respectable philosopher and be like,
He's really not.
Don't stop reading.
He's like literally always hated being a respectable philosopher. It's very funny.
Fair enough.
I mean, I actually think that that's might be the only way that he could satisfy my question. If you just fundamentally separate politics from justice, then there's no problem here. I mean, it means that you could have justice and then politics goes on, and that's okay. Then you're just talking about democracy. People challenge the conditions of their exclusion, they challenge dominant norms, they engage in politics.
Yeah.
But if the language of the police is normative and so on, then you're talking about injustice. And then I think that there's another way, which is that justice is just not possible. There is no such thing as legitimacy, even a historically contingent kind. And that's just a different vision that I don't love, but it's fine.
Maybe some context for why maybe he's putting some of these expressions as polemically as he does is... So on the one hand, I think he's really responding to this notion that politics is everywhere because power is everywhere, right? A kind of Foucault notion right there.
Seems to be
I like this point. I'm actually
takedown
with
of
this
Foucault.
part.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So power is everywhere, and that whether
everything's political. Listen, this morning I woke up and I made myself a little breakfast tortilla. Let me tell you.
Yeah, exactly.
Political.
Everything is political, and so
Micropolitics.
And so his response to that is I think that explains part of the reason why he wants to so forcefully insist on the rarity of politics is the profusion of the notion that everything is political. And he says quite clearly, look, it's not that I'm restricting the domain of politics. So many spaces, in any space in principle, any place or anything in principle could be political if it stages a confrontation between an egalitarian logic and egalitarian practice against one of naturalized hierarchy. But there is nothing in it inherently of itself that is political. It's actually really hard to do politics, right? It's really rare. It's really hard to, and that just from a general kind of ethos perspective, that I love. That for me was an oasis in the desert when I encountered it for the first time.
Yeah, because I think we all came of philosophical age in a deeply everything is political. I think it's like that now still.
I was steeped in a continental world where every text that that you deconstruct that's a political gesture, and every essay that you write is politics and
every time you set up
I know
your classroom, your syllabi.
No,
exactly.
This space is
your syllabus
politics.
is political. Yeah, it's
I'm just imagining someone, and maybe we should throw this up on the our official Twitter. I'm just imagining that meme of a man and a woman saying, I agree, who did you not ask? And then having Rancière's face, I disagree, and having a man and a woman being like, deconstruction is politics, and like, who did you not ask? Rancière, I disagree.
I do not think so.
No way.
Like, but what's also interesting, like what he says here, which is something like I couldn't imagine someone just saying now. Never mind the whole idea of everything you do is politics. Like I also found this actually a breath of fresh air. This idea of like, actually no, here are some actually really stringent criteria of what politics would have to effectuate for it to be politics. So you don't get to just lazily be like, it's politics because I say it's politics. My way of being in the world is politics. He even goes so far as to say as a strike isn't necessarily
speak for
politics.
yourself.
Yeah, speak for your, well, yeah. Some of us have more radical, experiences and ways of being in the world than us. I'm mere Dasein. I don't know what to tell you.
I've always said that about you, Will.
You are chilling in imminence, man. All I do is
When people see me walking down the street, they're just like, there goes Dasein again.
Look at that.
Just in its average,
he definitely is there.
He's fucking
he's
worlding.
like,
he's worlding in
there.
real time.
He's right there.
He's being right there.
Oh my
But
God.
even a strike for him
We gotta stop.
isn't necessarily politics because I could see how he could draw something like this from Marx, where there are places in Marx where he's like, okay, yes, better wages, that's important, but if you're not touching the fundamental background conditions, then you're missing the mark. You're moving let's put it this way, you're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so just like
and there are not enough lifeboats on that ship.
No, I can guarantee you there's one probably, and it's not for you. And so I thought that was really interesting that politics makes a particular a demand. And so maybe as Lillian was talking, I started thinking, is there a conception of justice in Rancière? I'm starting to think that there might not be, but bracketing that, this notion that politics is of this really high order of this specific type of activity, that seems like really, really nice to me. And I think it seems nice to me because it says, so what is politics doing? What confrontation is it staging? What new subjectivities is it bringing in? Because it's throwing a light on the social order that we have taken for granted, rather than you just do your everyday thing and that's politics because I don't know, you say it's politics.
And what's also lit is he does this like without being Hannah Arendt, he's not like the political.
Damn,
he's like,
next episode's gonna be a bummer.
It's gonna be
mine on Hannah Arendt.
Hold
Sorry.
on,
I
folks.
forgot. Are we? Somebody requested that on
next up
Twitter.
is Arendt. Yep, that's on the docket. It's on the agenda.
But yeah, like she has this but I'll just clarify what I mean by that so it's not like name dropping. But like she has this way of talking about the political as like speech and action with others and like ability to like hear and be heard and so on and so forth. And like I think it's interesting to set up the problem of a unique qualification for politics without without bracketing social questions. Because that's what she does. She's like political and social are different. Such an amazing claim, but it is what she says, and we can talk about that more next time. And I think, but like to motivate it, I think most people think that way. That like if you listen to like mainstream American news, radio, or whatever, they'll be like, "Don't make that political. Like, why is what you're doing political? It shouldn't be political. This should not be. Stop bringing politics into this." So like people definitely think that like politics is something distinct, and I think that Arendt has a particular way of talking about the kind of activity that it is as something distinct. And I happen to think that that's kind of a distinctly conservative way of thinking about politics. And I feel like what Rancière does that is like helpful is that he carves out a place for like, listen, people, not everything is a political act or problem. But he also like isn't bracketing the social world in that way. And I think that's
Yeah, because for Arendt, like the social as a sphere is inherently anti-political. It's based on like a kind of cyclical temporality, and there's no room for newness and all of that. And Rancière's point is not, he doesn't respond with the opposite claim, right? Which is that, yes, no, the social is inherently political. It's that, no, like the social is filled with sites of potential politicization. Like in the factory is a potentially political space. It isn't inherently political, but it is a site of politicization. The house, right? The site of domestic work isn't inherently political, but it can be like what's going on, like what kind of, what's being organized, like where are the sites of politics that are turning or like transforming the domestic space into a site of politics.
So I have a couple of things I want to say. One of them is that like this point that he's responding to the claim that everything is political and politics is everywhere is super helpful for getting a grip on what his intervention is. In fact, I think it's interesting to ask whether he himself is doing something political. And I think the answer has to be no, right? Like by the strict terms of his own kind of definition, like his work in political philosophy is not political, actually, I don't think, right? It's not something like this subjectification process in the name of inequality, which is presumed, like it's just not that. So there's an interesting question then about like what is at stake in his work, why, what is he doing and why, right? What's at stake in this theoretical enterprise? The second thing that I wanted to say is that it does maybe like, as a polemical inversion, you're right that like what he doesn't do is say that the social is all political. But the way in which he maybe swings too far going in the other direction is by suggesting that almost everything is the police. Almost everything is policing all the time. And like, again, like he's using it in an extremely unrestricted sense to mean not like literally when like agents of the state who are armed and have an authority or monopoly on violence. He means things like, and distribution also not necessarily in a material sense, thinking about like how resources are allocated, but things like what gets to appear, what literally at the level of aesthetic sensible perception, right? Like what counts as intelligible, right? What things make sense actually in a very broad way. That's what the object of policing is, right? And so this sort of aesthetic quality of politics is like, as you put it, Will, like staging the appearance, manifestation of something that's not supposed to be possible, that's not supposed to make sense in accordance with this order, right? So like someone speaking up and saying, right, Frederick Douglass, right? I have clearly look at my rationality, look at my linguistic facility, right? Like this is what you say is impossible. And then the last thing that I wanted to sort of see if I could get you all to talk more on was like, yeah, what's going on with this connection to subjectivation, right? Like that it's like a subjective process that politics is supposed to be about.
Can I just say something in response to the idea of the police being generic? So I would ask the question in response to this problem, which I do sense myself, and again, I am, I think I'm in favor of a more restrictive use of the term police. But I think if you ask yourself, what social or institutional spaces in our societies do not, to some extent, police, are not to some extent policed by norms of behavior of who can be in there, who can be in those institutions, how they're perceived when they're there, when you're in a university, when you're in a courtroom, when you're in the halls of politics, when you're at a workplace. Like when
you're in a union.
When you're in a union.
Yeah.
The charitable way of reading, I think, the generic nature of Rancière's notion of the police is to say that there is a distribution and a capacitation of bodies and functions and roles that cuts across every institution from the highest to the lowest of at least our social order. I mean, sometimes I think it gets a little too transcendental talking about all social orders, and the politics and the police sounds like a transcendental theory of political theory.
Yes.
I fucking rock with that though.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie.
I think that's a good point. I think that's a substantive point. I would say I think unions are more like the mob. I think mob is better for them. Like I think about.
Wait, could you say more?
Go on.
I think this is. Well, I was just thinking about like this is like kind of sideways of. Okay, yes, I have thought about unions as being more like a mob on numerous occasions because I have tried to think about like when people misbehave in strikes or scabs or even something that doesn't rely on collective action, like that isn't that kind of high stakes moment. If union members did something disrespectful, say they slept with somebody's wife, or they said something racist, or like something that was like not with the with what the culture and the union wanted. The answer is to just like take them out back and like beat the shit out of them. And then that was the end of that story. And like today we have these conversations about norms that are kind of like, you know, trying to install new policing mechanisms, like things you can and can't say, proper etiquette, and so on. And I've always thought, this is mostly in activist groups, I don't think this is true in unions unless they're like a grad student union. But it's like
the worst kind of union.
Still necessary, but
the union I support, by the way, but they are the only kind
Completely.
of union that's going to have these particular kinds of norms.
Theoreticist deviations, yes.
Theoreticist deviations, yeah. But like, I was just thinking about how that does kind of try to like impose a kind of policing. You know, we always talk about the policing of language. And I'm thinking to myself, like, in some ways, I think this is all really overblown. Like, but on the other hand, there's something true about it. Like, anyone who's ever been in an environment like that knows that it is absolutely true. Everyone's self-censoring, and the language policing is a real phenomena. And I'm like, what is an alternative way of dealing with this? And then I was like, you know how they used to just beat the shit out of you in the back.
we have to go back.
Yeah. So like,
Reject
this is kind of
modernity, embrace tradition. Yeah.
I mentioned this on the stream we did with Femi the other day. You know, like, revive the old left man. They had some insights that are worth your time. And same thing with scabs. You know, like, that was a kind of confrontation that was, you know, mob justice is what I would describe it as.
Okay, so I am now brought to this point where I'm starting to see something actually, I will say, deeply unsettling in Rancière's account. Because I think, Gil, you are right. When you called me to order, you policed me. When I was like, well, Rancière does say this is a neutral, non-pejorative, and you're like, I disagree. We're going to rein that back, and that's unintelligible. I get that. But, I think, the way we've been talking about some forms of policing, even if Rancière doesn't mean it, some forms of policing seem to be, quite useful. So if you're trying to organize something, let's, we don't even need to go all, quote unquote, political to unions. You're just trying to have a fucking meeting. And, in the middle of that meeting, someone decides to start doing politics and create some new subjectivity and say, we're challenging the bounds of social order, and, noise is getting converted into speech, and the faculty meeting that's supposed to be an hour is 2 hours now, it's 3 hours now. You want to be like, get that politics out of here. We're trying to do something.
Well, maybe that's why there are always police orders. I mean, maybe that's
me.
the answer to why for him there's always a police order.
There
is no, like, a world without a police order is a totally incoherent social order, potentially, right?
Yeah, so the uncomfortable thing two uncomfortable things I wanted to say was, one, if we buy Rancière's distinction between, politics and the police, the two logics that they have. One, when you are, say, policing language, what I like with Rancière is you can say, you're not doing politics. And, like, like it or not,
you are literally just the
it.
police.
You're the fucking cops.
What it is.
You're the cops.
I thought you were all a cab, and now you're the cab. I don't know what to tell you. But the other unsettling thing is you might think that Rancière sets up the value term of politics and the value term of police, but it now actually seems like even politics actually is a neutral term, and that not every instant of politics is quote unquote good. It can be massively disruptive. It can be massively incapacitating vis-a-vis a certain goal that you are trying to accomplish. And like now I'm finding myself drawn back into, wait a second, so what is justice for Rancière? Do we care about justice? But I want to throw down the polemical that I think even politics is not, according to his logic, whatever Rancière the man wants it to be, is not necessarily good. It's not necessarily that's great that this happened.
I don't know. Okay, so first, that's really helpful. I think first I'm going to buy your claim that not all policing as such is bad, right? And certainly not useful to have politics erupting. When you were giving that example before, I swear to God, I don't know if you guys could see, I was writhing in my seat as someone who has
We saw.
Oh, I was having such a bad time. I was having like straight up Vietnam style acid flashbacks to meetings being
Back to
disrupted
politics.
by self-styled radicals who needed to score points. And I was, oh God. Anyway, but like, yes. So you know, order norms. We might say, I think the four of us on this show, like, yeah, actually norms are good. In fact, sometimes, and we like them, and they're necessary. Right. And if we call that policing, okay, sure. Maybe sometimes we got to be the police, I guess. It feels bad.
Ooh,
But
that's the drop quote.
yeah, oof. But okay. But here's the thing, though. Like, I don't think that I can. So I can get on board with the not all policing necessarily bad, I guess. Right. I'm not sure that I can think Rancière means that that politics isn't always good. I think he thinks it's always good.
I think he personally does, but I think Will's right that it's not. I don't
it's hard
see. I
theoretically.
also don't see in the theory
Yeah.
like where the normative valorization of it is.
And also, when was this book written?
1995.
95. But wait, no. Hold on. Chapter 2 is called Wrong. Okay?
Yeah.
It's called Wrong.
Yes, morally wrong.
Okay.
Morally
Normative.
wrong.
Whoa.
Normatively,
Whoa.
it is wrong.
I hate to be this pedantic translator.
Give it to me.
But the French word is tort.
It's
T-O-R-T. Tort.
Yeah. Tort,
Right?
yeah.
Which is a dispute.
It also means wrong, dude.
I mean,
Okay.
I mean, listen,
listen,
like,
in tort, what is
there's
tort
a legal,
law? Like tort
yeah,
law is
legal sense of injury, maybe.
it's
Let's ask the people.
It's
Let's
harm
ask
or
Twitter.
damage. No, tort law is about harm or damage and what
Mm-hmm.
needs to be rectified in order for the damage to be made right, for the wrong to be made right.
Okay.
It's a sense of rectificatory justice. And this, I think, is at least implicitly operative in the conception, right? Wherein there is a miscount, a disidentity between the way that the police order says that things have to be ordered and the actual people who are constitutively excluded from appearing as such within that order. And they name that and they perform it, and that is a wrong that they like this
Okay,
feels
but one
normative.
important clarification, though, is that by wrong, he doesn't mean the victimization element of it, right? He doesn't
No.
mean the actual injury. For him, the wrong is actually, it only exists as a wrong when it's polemically constructed
Yes.
in a political confrontation, right? It isn't that the thing.
So it's after the fact.
It is. It's after the fact, and it's the result of organization and political construction. It isn't the original harm or something. For him, that's a moral question. There's moral
Wait,
wrong.
so you can't say something is wrong before it's politicized?
No. There's a moral wrong, let's say, right? Let's say the actual
Okay.
harm or injury that happens to people. But I think for him that he's trying to distinguish that from political wrong, this like tort, this dispute in which you like the wrong is it only comes to be constituted as a wrong when it's constructed in a political like confrontations. I don't know. It's kind of now I'm trying to
No,
sort
it
through
seems like
I'm confusing myself about it, but yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and I don't want you to because I think you're on my team here, and I think this might be our first dispute on the podcast. So I'm trying not to lose an ally. It seems to me that with politics, what he's trying to say is that it becomes a wrong when it's enunciated in the movement of politics of making the claim that if you want to even use the Memphis sanitation workers strike, I am a man. And that, this is when it becomes, intelligible and viable. Obviously, we can say the segregation is a moral wrong, but he's working at this level of abstraction. And so it seems to me that, he wants to say that this is, a fact that happens, that it is claimed as a wrong. And I'm not sure he has the resources to say that, to make a sort of normative judgment that every instance of politics. So let me put it this way. Perhaps we might say that for certain purposes, we need a political order or some social order, something like that, needs to have a miscount. Maybe, the miscount isn't a morally wrong thing. It's just, an effect of how it can run well. And so that's why I was trying to reach for the point of, does he have the resources, even despite his own personal politics, whatever his personal politics may be, to say that every instance of politics is immediately must be good, whatever we mean by good. I think by good mean productive, advances something. One could say something like there are instances of politics that are, deeply disruptive and can introduce, maybe he wouldn't use the language of regression, but type of regression.
I think it's maybe helpful to point out there's one place in the chapter that we read where he says specifically when that there are better and worse police orders, what is a better police order, i.e. a better social and political order, it is the one that has been confronted the most, ruptured the most, like has been in the most conflict, has been hammered with egalitarian emancipatory struggles the most, right? And if you take any country in the
you're
world,
my ally on this?
I'm with you on this.
Are you sure? Because I think you're killing my point. Actually,
Well, no, I mean, I don't think so. But so let's go back to the
The
example of
shifting alliances.
the sanitation workers, right? It might be the case that you can claim rationally that there's a moral wrong, right, in a segregated society, segregated workplaces, and the conditions of labor under segregation, right? That it's morally wrong. But it doesn't. There's a descriptive point to be made that it doesn't get registered as a political wrong until it gets politicized in a kind of litigious confrontation with the order that's keeping them there, right? It wasn't until the strike, until those demonstrations, until other strikes, that it actually becomes politically salient as a wrong, I guess, versus a moral wrong.
okay, all right.
Does that? I don't know. I don't know. I think we're back on the same page here.
Wait, well,
I
what's
think-
the other
yeah.
side to this dispute again?
So my side of the dispute, as we're polemicizing things, is I'm saying, is it the case that Rancière's theory has the resources to say that every instance of politics, every eruption, every creation of new subjects or something like that, is without having to look at the context always good? Mm-hmm. Or is it that it is simply, him saying this is a thing that happens, and in some ways, in some instances, it might be what we would call better. In others, it might not. And that's why I kind of use the example of you're trying to have a meeting to organize what you're going to do or to get something done, and then disruption comes, and people are like, let's create a new order, not even create a new order, just challenge this order. And so I'm wondering, do we have the resources to say that we can say that every eruption, every challenge to an order of policing must be good? Or are we simply saying that is a thing that happened?
Why don't we hash it up through an example, like the truckers? This thing that's happening right now, the so-called occupation
I was wondering if this was going to happen.
Oh my God. Okay,
I mean,
let's go.
that is one place to hash it up. There are ways in which I can see elements of what Rancière describes as politics.
Yeah.
He often rails against the restriction of the political sphere of participation to those who are experts. And so, you have, a resistance to expertise. On the other hand, and you have also, by the way, a kind of staging and all of these different, I don't know if the bouncy gym counts as staging, but whatever. There are all kinds of things happening in there that are don't just take the form of demands. But at the same time, here's one way to certainly say that it is not politics for Rancière, is that the people that are the subject that it is bringing into existence or that it is manifesting is not a part of those without part, a miscounted part of the populace. I mean, by and large, it's owner-operators of trucking companies, right, that are the initiators.
Quite a significant part.
This is why
in our society.
this is why I don't. Okay, now I don't know what to make of the truckers, but I do think that saying that politics are only politics when people who are excluded or unequal do shit is just not true. I don't just help me make sense.
It doesn't
of
have to be that without it. You could say, are they presenting an egalitarian logic, or is it? You know what I mean? Would you agree that
what does
politics
that mean?
is inherently an egalitarian enterprise?
That's what I'm saying is why does he think that? And then I just feel like this is very, if I do say so myself, not the most Marxist way of going about the situation. So when people organize the business roundtable or the manufacturers association and they're we are going to suppress poor people and the people who work for us as much as humanly possible.
Yeah,
this
police
is our
them.
goal. We're going to police the shit out of them. But we're it's not, no. You see, that's I just feel that's shifting around definitions to kind of suit the conflict. Because they're doing it, it's the police, and if it's not them, and it's politics if the oppressed do it. And I don't know, you have to have a way of making sense of the other side of the story, in a way that isn't just.
Yeah, he doesn't have a good theory of reactionary social movements. No.
Yeah, or just conflict. What is the other side of the conflict doing? They're engaged interest.
Yeah.
And even in the absence of strong oppositional movements, securing interest, And like, I don't know, like for lack of it. So I don't know. I was watching Babylon Berlin some months ago, that TV show. And it just struck me that, you've got this crazy situation in Weimar Germany where like the communists are being slaughtered, on May Day by the SPD, and, the Nazis are all like running amok in their youth associations, and they're doing all this stuff, and they're organizing themselves behind the scenes. And just to like look at the terrain and be like, yes, the communists are doing politics and the Nazis are not doing politics seems like not true to me. And like,
I spontaneously
I'm not,
agree with that.
I'm not saying no.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's counterintuitive to me. That's all.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that maybe this is actually, now that we're deep in this conversation, what I'm getting reminded of, longtime listeners will remember our third ever episode on Leclau and Mouffe. And I'm having sort of flashbacks again to that. You're all looking at me like you look all very upset. I'm very sorry.
Owen is not liking that.
But
He's like, you're degrading this.
Not happy
Don't
with
do
that.
it.
But here's why.
How dare you even invoke those names?
Here's why. Like one of the things that I feel there's like a real resonance or affinity of, like their whole claim in the Hegemony and Socialist Strategy book is that there is not a pre-existing subject of socialist politics, right, called something like the working class or the proletariat or the party, right? There is not one. It's only in and through political activity and organization that something like the subject of politics comes to be, right? It doesn't pre-exist its enunciation or staging. And that's kind
They're
of what
hostile to the notion that the working class does politics, though.
Listen,
right?
I know that.
Rancière's examples are all examples of proles.
I completely agree. But we do have, and I think this maybe gets at like, maybe the basis of the problem that I think I'm totally on Lillian's team with and feeling nervous about some of what's going on here. We get claims like, there isn't something like he says explicitly, like, I know, right? He's like, I'm down with the working class, baby. I love it. I love it when Blanqui is in court and they go, what's your profession? And he says proletarian. And Rancière's like, tight. I love that shit, right? It's cool. It's good. But he also says things like that there is no such thing as the proletariat before its announcement of itself, like as a subject, there are no parties. Like there's an explicit line. There's no such thing as a party. Parties do not exist prior to the declaration of wrong, right? They don't. And so before we said, Will was talking about it, right? There's no, you were talking about it with Will. There's no wrong prior to its declaration. There's also no party. There's no interest. There's no constitution of a class or a group until this process of subjectivation takes place. So it's as rare as politics are, that's as rare as subjects are, right? Subjects don't exist for the most part either. But I feel like with Lillian, I don't know. I feel like we could talk about there being different classes prior to the proles standing up and saying we want not to be poor. You know what I mean? I don't know.
In itself, for itself, baby. That's what we're about.
We love it, but because I'm like a dog with a goddamn bone here, though. I am more and more convinced that I am right because I think with again there's Rancière's examples and clearly his intuitions, but this notion that the wrong becomes enunciating the subjectivization. One could say, either if we're using the example of Nazis or using the example of white supremacists, when white supremacists stage this idea of white genocide is happening, we are now the excluded. That is a moment of bringing in a new subject of saying we stand for a universal subject that ought to be, and of course this universal subject has delimitations, but of course it does on Rancière's account because the announcement of the universal is the particular saying I stand for the universal, so that's not a problem. And what it would just be pure caprice to say, well, that's not politics because we don't like that thing. That has to be the police.
No, okay. And I do think that like this is an empirical. I think that at this point in the analysis, we have to like get to the empirical, right? And say like, is it true that there are a part that has no part? In fact, given this ordering, this police ordering, this social world that we live in, is it true that they are speaking as the excluded part that has no part? They are saying that they're doing that, and I think empirically that is false, and Rancière would say this. I don't know if you agree, Owen.
So, I mean, I think, let's go back to the example of the proletariat. I mean,
Yeah.
I think from the perspective of the police order, with the example he gives of Blanqui invoking the proletariat as a collective entity that he belongs to, right?
Which is
In that context, right, you have a police order, an existing, a reigning social and economic and political order, in which that only acknowledges like individual workers. It doesn't acknowledge the existence of a bloc called the proletariat, because the minute you acknowledge that, then you are in a totally different political game, a totally different political contestation versus if you have an individual. So one of his claim is that like the proletariat only gets constituted as a political actor called the proletariat that actually, enters the scene as a player on the political stage at the moment of its like litigious constitution in its struggle for emancipation, right? It isn't as just a social category. That's easy. Like the police order can always deal with social categories. It's happy to do with that. It's happy with those kind of categorizations of like, ethnicity and religion or whatever. Like you break things down, you're an individual member of this passive group. But there's a difference between a passive categorization and an active group agency or group constitution. And I think that, again, I know that, like, you're not wrong, and I'm really trying to, like, get into the details of how he puts things in order to pull out why I think it's maybe more legit than you're giving it credit for. But I do think that there's a difference between the proletariat as an economic class and the proletariat as a politically constituted, like, agent. And he's interested in that process of constitution. How does that happen? What are the gestures that throw themselves onto the stage of politics rather than just being passive recipients of social reality?
Okay, but then does that mean that you kind of agree that like politics can happen if it's not in fact the excluded, like the miscounted that are doing it?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get clear on.
So I do agree with that. I do agree with that, and I don't know how to square with that. The fact that I generally agree with this constitution. Well, I guess like you could look if you take.
That's all I was looking for. So
yeah.
Agreement. We got agreement.
Yeah.
Pack
Thank
it up,
God.
y'all. Let's
I
take
feel
it out.
like, okay.
We did spend an hour talking about a book called Disagreement, and I think we've
100%.
I'm sorry,
come we've come to a consensus. No politics has occurred.
The police have returned.
We're all policing each
Yes.
other, all four of us.
Have you guys
Yep.
read that? There's an article that's been circulating that Anton Yeager wrote that's pretty good about hyperpolitics. Why everything now is political.
Oh no.
About hyperpolitics.
Can you send that to the group
No,
chat?
I saw it.
share
going
that around.
but-
I actually think it's I'm raising it because I think it's relevant. He's talking about how, like, if you recall, and so many eons ago, in the 2000s, it was like the conversation was about apathy. Like people are not political. It was like post-politics.
Oh, nice.
Now it feels like everything is
Jeez.
political. Literally
Imagine if
everything.
that was the problem. It's so far
But,
away
like-
from us.
Bring out.
But literally everything now is political, and he calls it like hyperpolitics.
Nice.
And tries to diagnose some reasons why, like it feels like everything is political, but nothing is changing, which is a pretty interesting thing. And like I feel like just to like kind of give some contemporary relevance to this sort of reasons to delimit what is political, however one chooses to carve it up. Like I actually have been re-motivated to think that there's always going to be an unsatisfactory, like whatever analysis I come up with what is political and what's not is probably not going to be satisfying to anyone but me. But I do think there's a reason to try it out, because like the mantra that like the personal is political or the everything is political is tiresome and not necessarily solving our problems. So like, I don't know. I just think it's like a dope question
It's
to
becoming another
try
police order.
to.
Like posting is political. I think that's the unstated.
The
assumption.
posting is political.
Posting is
Posting
political.
yeah.
I feel like I should say, because I've been very sort of demanding, and I've always had a sort of on-off again relationship with Rancière, and I'm nervous about the conceptions or whatever.
It's a bit of a will they won't they?
Yeah, it's a real will they won't they.
We're like,
am I going to kiss him on the mouth? We don't know. Maybe, it's not. But I do want to say that like I like him. I like it a lot. Like I am very on board, especially with the sentiment, the feeling, like his spontaneous sorts of affinities. I don't I don't hate it nearly as much as I hate the 𝙁𝙤𝙀 stuff, right? But I just do think that there are like problems. I have worries, but I'm mostly down. And again, every one of his examples is fucking sick, and I love his archival work.
I really want to square what, like your point, Lillian, that like the situation you described in Weimar Germany of all this different play of political forces, that those different group formations like are politics. I believe that, and I want to square that with Rancière's insistence that politics takes this very restrictive shape. And I think one way to do that is to say everything I just said about how a group of people who are a kind of social category politicize themselves and form a collective bloc. Like that's a necessary part of politics for Rancière, political subjectification. And that it's only like left politics, and here the normative element might sneak in, right? It's only left politics, it's only liberatory politics or emancipatory when that group consolidation happens with the principle of equality undergirding it, whether it's stated or unstated, right? There are many different political group formations and modes of political group formation. But if they don't have an egalitarian foundation, if they aren't founded on a principle or a commitment to equality and a principle of equality, then they are, who cares whether we call them political or not? Here's where I leave Rancière. Like they're different in some salient way. And we should be able to mark that difference, Does that make sense?
I mean, I feel like it could be that, like, I like that. I think that that is a way of creating the consistency. And it could be that what he's saying is that there's, like, reactionary politics and emancipatory politics, and that's what you're trying to figure out. But I think my problem, it's like if you frame it that way, I like that. But he doesn't frame it that way, and that's like what kind of like
yes, thank you.
Like that is like what I'm.
We are saving him
like
from
not,
himself.
I feel like you've given him a leg up, but I'm not sure that's what he actually said. And I wonder if it's like, okay, you're writing in the 90s. You might not have thought reactionary politics would have their moment once more in the same way. I just wonder if that like. You might not have had that on the brain. But you might have been thinking instead about the apathy I mentioned and like the way people don't have an understanding of what politics entails, and that's what you're primarily worried about, and therefore you frame it in the way that he does.
Yeah, I think that his paradigmatic, like, he's writing from a moment of like enormous stability in the field of political forces, right, in 1995 and in Western Europe. And I think that it seems to me, I think others have said this, that the paradigmatic example of him, he's looking around for like a contemporary example of a kind of emancipatory politics or the kind of like political subjectification that he's talking about. And the example he comes back to and that is often associated with him is the example of like the sans-papiers, undocumented workers in France, and their like attempts to to theatrically seize the citizenship they don't have, their various different modes of political presentation and organization. Like that seems paradigmatic for him. And I do think whether he's aware of it or not, this is where I have an issue with the transcendentalization of like where I think he wants to make he wants to look at a certain set of historical examples and his own contemporary moment and then establish a transcendental theory of politics, right?
This is politics.
Like, this is what the condition of the existence of politics is, and this is what its opposite is, and that kind of tracks across all social orders. I don't know. I think that might be one historical explanation for why, and that's not
to egalitarianism.
No, Owen, this is always what you're so great about, because I feel like, Owen, you've constantly been saddled with giving us the figures that we go at the hardest, and you're like, I'm going to give the old college try,
because
whether it's Foucault. Yeah,
because I've come up in the French scene, man. Yeah, so,
that's
and I know there's some hostility to.
Yeah. And I also do want to say that I feel like you did a great job. You've now assuaged my concerns as well. And,
thank you. Okay, let's go.
And you've done that by saying that I was right, and I think that was great of you. That felt like politics.
Okay,
Welcome,
I still
comrade.
maintain, for all of their faults, Rancière, Badiou, and Balibar, who I kind of all discovered at the same time, have been on the whole a real force for good in French philosophy.
That's
in
not
pushing
wrong.
back.
That's definitely right.
I think pushing back against the obscurantism, against the like wholesale rejection of universality, the wholesale rejection of like truth, the wholesale rejection of political subjectivity. Like they have been, I think, like in the 90s they did a massive service, I think, to political theory, especially on the continent.
I buy that.
I agree.
All right. Well, on that point of agreement, I guess we'll wrap up for today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We wouldn't be able to do this without you, and we're really grateful. So today's new patrons are Melanie Brusler, Jules Galbraith, Gavin Redding, Ren Christensen, Fletcher Calcanio, David Griscom, hey David, Will Twiner, Mary Sanazero, Dexter, Nandan Mani Ratnam, Dan Pittman, Caroline Grant, Divya Siddharth, Kenneth McKee, PJ Shoemaker, Gabe McMahon, Devin C. Hobdy, Luke Fiddler, Stephen Lazaro, Daniel Ucko. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. Follow us on Twitter at leftofphil. And don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. Super key. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.